You are not bad with money. You have just never been shown the one thing that decides everything else. You check your bank account, and it feels like you are running on a treadmill someone else is controlling. Rent goes up. Groceries go up. Your paycheck barely moves. And somehow, people who do not seem smarter than you are somehow further ahead. That feeling is not in your head. It is not laziness. It is not a discipline problem. There is one force quietly deciding who gets ahead and who stays behind, and almost nobody explains it properly. It is not your salary. It is not your job title. It is not even how much you save. It is time, multiplied against itself, in a way most people never get taught to see. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why you feel behind, and it will stop feeling personal. Stay with me, because this is the part nobody explains in school, in college, or at your first job orientation. This is compound interest, and it is the reason the gap between you and everyone else keeps widening. Here is the part that gets buried under spreadsheets and jargon. Compound interest is not really about money. It is about time turning small amounts into large ones, quietly, in the background, without asking your permission. Money that is invested does not just sit there. It earns a return, and then it earns a return on that return. Year 1, it grows a little. Year 10, it grows on top of everything it already grew. Year 30, the growth on the growth becomes bigger than anything you originally put in. This is not a trick, it is math. But math without a starting date does nothing. And that is the part nobody sat you down and explained. The date you start is worth more than the amount you start with. Two people can save the exact same total amount of money in their life. If one starts 10 years earlier than the other, the early starter can end up with almost double, sometimes more. Not because they worked harder, not because they earned more, because time did the heavy lifting they never saw happening. Now think about your own life for a second. Nobody handed you this explanation at 18. Nobody sat you down at 22 and said, "The clock just started." And every year you wait costs you more than the year before it. You were busy paying rent, paying off a degree, trying to survive your 20s like everyone else. So when people say you are behind, what they are really describing is a math problem you were never invited to solve early enough. This is not about blame. This is about finally seeing the mechanism. Because once you see it, the feeling changes from shame into clarity. You are not behind because you are bad with money. You are behind because the most important variable in wealth building was never explained to you in a way that made you act on it in time. Let's put real numbers on this because vague feelings deserve concrete proof. In 2026, the typical American household under the age of 35 has a median retirement balance of just $18,880. Not the average, the median, the number that represents the actual person in the middle, not the outliers pulling the number up. Meanwhile, the amount Americans now say they need to retire comfortably has climbed to $1.46 million. That is not a typo, and that is not a scare tactic. That is simply where the number landed in 2026. Look at the gap between those two numbers for a second. It is not a small gap. It is not a rounding error. It is the entire story of what happens when time is not on your side yet. Now here is the part that should genuinely make you feel less alone. 1 in 4 Americans nearing retirement, ages 55 to 64, has less than $19,000 saved. These are not careless people. These are people in the final decade before retirement, still catching up. If it were purely about effort, this gap would have closed by now for millions of hardworking people. It has not. Look at people in their mid-40s to mid-50s. The median retirement balance sits around $87,000. The commonly cited benchmark for that age range is roughly $450,000. That is close to a 5 times gap for people who have been working their entire adult lives. This is not a small group of unlucky exceptions. This is the middle of the entire American workforce. And here is the number that really tells the story. Among people the same age, in the same 55 to 64 bracket, the top 10% of savers have roughly 9 times more than the person in the exact middle. 9 times. Not 9% more. 9 times more. Some of that is income, yes. But a huge portion of that gap is simply who started earlier and let time compound quietly in the background. This is the part competitors talk around without ever naming clearly. They will tell you to save more, invest smarter, cut your spending. What they rarely say out loud is that the size of the gap you're feeling right now is mathematically explainable, and it has very little to do with your character. So let's steelman the other side for a second, because it deserves to be said honestly. Someone will say, you should have started investing at 22 instead of 32. And technically, they are right. 10 years earlier really does change the outcome dramatically because of how compounding works. But that advice, said to you now, is like telling someone stuck in traffic that they should have left the house earlier. True. Useless. And it completely ignores why they left when they did in the first place. Most people in their 20s are not ignoring compound interest out of laziness. They simply were never taught it existed as something urgent. Financial literacy was not a required class. Nobody explained that a decade of delay costs more than a decade of extra income later ever could recover. So the real question is not why didn't you start sooner? The real question is, now that you understand the mechanism, what changes starting today? Because here is something most people miss. Compounding does not care about your past. It only responds to what you do from this point forward. A person who starts at 35 with clarity and consistency can still build extraordinary results by 65. It will not look identical to someone who started at 22. But it is not the same as having no chance at all. The version of you that feels behind right now is comparing your Chapter 1 to someone else's Chapter 20. That comparison was never fair, and it was never the full picture. What changes everything is realizing the gap you feel is a starting point problem, not a worth problem. Here is the identity shift that actually matters. Being behind is not who you are. It is where your compounding curve currently sits. Those are two completely different things, and only one of them is permanent. A curve can be moved. A person's worth cannot be measured by a chart. So, once you stop treating the number in your bank account as a verdict on your character, something loosens in your chest. You stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is the next input I control?" Because the truth is, the exact same math that made you feel behind is the same math that can start working for you. It does not require getting rich overnight. It does not require a windfall or a lucky break. It requires understanding that consistency, applied early and left alone, does more work than most people's entire salary. This is not motivational fluff. This is the same mechanism, running in the opposite direction once you engage with it. The people who look ahead of you right now are not necessarily smarter or luckier. In many cases, they simply started their clock earlier, sometimes by just a few years. And a few years, compounded over decades, is the entire story behind almost every gap you have ever felt. So the shame lifts, because shame was never the accurate emotion here. Awareness is. You cannot go back and start at 22. Nobody can. But you can absolutely start today. And today, compounding does not know or care that you are starting later than someone else. It only cares that you started and that you stay consistent from here forward. This is why understanding compound interest is not just a finance lesson. It is genuinely the difference between feeling like a failure and feeling like someone mid-story. You are not behind a person. You are behind a number. And numbers can move. The feeling that everyone else figured out something you missed usually comes from comparing your current chapter to someone else's later one. Once you see the mechanism clearly, the emotional weight around money starts to lighten, even before your bank balance changes. That shift in how you see yourself is often the actual turning point, more than any single dollar amount. This channel exists to hand you the real numbers behind the feelings you already carry, without the noise, without the shame, without the lecture. If understanding why you feel behind mattered to you today, subscribe, because the next real number might be the one that changes how you see your own timeline.